The Fantasy by Polish composer Sigismund Stojowski was written in 1905 when he was living in Paris, just before he moved to New York City, where he would live for the rest of his life. This piece was one that I didn't know very well until I was judging a competition in Finland a few years back, and it was one of the compulsory pieces in the first round. Despite hearing it over and over for an entire day, I still fell in love with it and started to work on it on my own and use it with my students. As I've mentioned in a few of my tips videos, it's important to take into account the title of a piece. The word fantasy is not just a cool word to call a piece, it actually has some implications and meanings from music history. For a lot of music history, a fantasy or fantasia or fantaisie in French has its roots in improvisation. If you go back to the Baroque or classical eras of music, a fantasy would actually have improvisation of some kind in it, especially if you're talking about the works of J.S. Bach. As you get closer to the 20th century, when this piece was written, a fantasy wouldn't have actual improvisation in it, but it would have more of an improvised feeling about the piece. Maybe there's not such a strict form, or the composer will move very quickly from one feeling to another or one theme to another. This piece might remind a lot of trombonists of the Ropart's piece in E-flat minor, which was written actually a few years after this piece. They both have these long sweeping melodies, which means that not only do you have to have a really good idea of phrasing, but you also have to have a really well-defined breathing plan. There are often times in this piece where there's not really a great place to breathe, and so you have to sort of pick the least bad place to breathe so that you break up the phrase in the most natural and organic way possible. Additionally, Stojowski does this thing where he puts duple rhythms and dotted rhythms in the same phrase with triplet rhythms. When a composer does that, it's very important that you, as the performer, help each rhythm sound like itself. The duple and dotted rhythms need to sound very obviously duple and dotted, and the triplet rhythms need to sound very round and stretched like a triplet ought to sound. I've had many teachers over the years remind me of a good rule of thumb, which is never let a good half step go to waste. Many times in a piece like this that has these soaring melodies, we think of the large intervals as the most expressive intervals, and they certainly can be. But don't forget that also small intervals, the smallest interval of a half step, can also be very, very expressive, and Stojowski uses a lot of chromaticism throughout the piece. Hopefully you can hear in my performance video that every time I have half steps, I'm trying to get every ounce of emotion out of those that I can. Another thing to think about with this piece is that it almost never has a steady tempo for an extended period of time. It really needs flexibility in the tempo, let it move forward and back, ebb and flow with the energy of the piece. Now, that might make some people feel a little uncomfortable, especially if you've never played a piece like that. But this piece actually really needs that in order to bring across that improvised fantasy quality that we talked about before. It almost needs to seem like the music is coming to you and your collaborator in the moment. Lastly, one of the biggest technical challenges in this whole piece, of course, is a few measures from the end. We have that beautiful arpeggio that starts on a low A and culminates in a high C sharp. That, for almost any trombonist, is going to be the biggest technical challenge. You'll of course need to work on your high range with your private teacher and make sure that the note is secure. But my one piece of advice I give to everyone is this. I would not recommend that you start practicing that phrase too softly. we see that pianissimo dynamic and we try to insist with ourselves it has to be as quiet as possible. And ultimately, that is where we want to go. But if you start from that place, it can lead you to some unhelpful habits and maybe some tension. I encourage you to start working on that phrase at a more comfortable dynamic. Get it to the point where it floats out effortlessly with a great sound and great pitch. Then, once you're comfortable doing that, you can bring it down gradually where you want it to be in the end. I hope some of this is helpful, and I hope you have fun working on the Stojowski fantasy.